So today, as we're going through the book of Jude, I have my Star Wars shirt on, and in the just talk about Star Wars for just a second before we get into the scripture stuff, and just bear with me, please. So, in the original, very first episode, episode 4, A New Hope, Luke Skywalker's aboard the Millennium Falcon, and Han Solo's there, and Obi-Wan's teaching Luke how to use a lightsaber, and Luke's getting zapped by the little, robot thing, and Han Solo turns to Luke Skywalker and he says, kid, I've been around a lot of different planets and I've never seen anything that like the Force. It's just a bunch of fancy tricks and mumbo jumbo. Something along those lines. I don't have the exact quote, but you know that part that I'm talking about. You see, it's at that point in time in Star Wars that two different worldviews collide. One is the Han Solo character, who is the classical, I have to experience this to believe it. And Luke is the hero character that takes what this old Obi-Wan Kenobi guy is saying and takes it just at face value and starts being able to somewhat, there is something impossible or very strange that can go on here. What this whole series is about is the idea about two different worldviews. One is that we have a very scientific type of worldview that we want to say that, we know all of this and we have all the answers for everything, and for the answers that we don't, somehow we can come up with them. We have somewhat on the other side a religious or a philosophical worldview that says, God's in charge, and we just have to take the Bible at face value, and all of this will somehow work its way out because we're right, and this side's saying we're right, and both sides are probably mostly wrong. What I've been trying to do is trying to be able to take what Scripture says and be able to take a look at where it is that we've come from. And what I've come to understand is that in our scientific method, there are some things that the reality of it is that for science to really be science, we have to be able to duplicate it and replicate it multiple times to say, okay, this is what happened 99 times out of 100 with the exception of one anomaly, and why did the anomaly happen? When we're dealing with this topic, and here's the topic that we're going to talk about today, is creation and creationism. Creationism is not a scientifically provable thought worldview. But the reality of it is that evolution isn't either. And the reason I say that is because evolution cannot be duplicated in the laboratory. Nobody was there to observe it. It wasn't an observable thing. And one thing that I've heard recently, and I really kind of hold on to this truth, is that science hates one-time events. We want to be able to see things time and time and time and time again for us to be able to grasp, okay, this is how this thing works in this particular situation. When we come up to worldviews, here's the worldview that Jude starts off with, and he talks about the worldview of these people who have a anti-biblical worldview, or even a worldview that I would even say anti-church. And in the book of Jude, here's what happens. Jude pulls out three of the absolute craziest things that you could argue. And I want to say, because these were the things that were argued, I don't believe that creation was argued at that point in time. I'm going to share with you in our next episode a little bit more about the roots of evolutionism, and may surprise you on where it comes from. But right now, let's take a look at Jude. Here it is. He said, though you already know all of this. Well, Captain Obvious shows up in Scripture occasionally. He says, I want to remind you that the Lord at one time delivered his people out of Egypt, but later destroyed those who did not believe. Verse 6 is one of these verses that we just kind of cringe in our religiosity, especially if you're into what I call churchianity. And churchianity is that, we can believe whatever we want to believe as long as we love Jesus. And I'm going to say there's a whole lot more to this subject than we need to deal with. But let's take a look at what verse 6 says in the book of Jude and just start dealing with this, or at least get the topic out there to where we can talk about it in a later episode. He said, "And the angels who did not keep their positions of authority, but they abandoned their proper dwelling, these, the angels, he has kept in darkness, bound with everlasting chains for judgment on the great day." Jude, in verse 6, goes from, here's Old Testament book of Exodus, to maybe Genesis 6 and the Nephilim. He's at least talking about some kind of angels who, maybe because of pride or maybe because they wanted to side with the enemy, that they decided to give up their place. They did not keep their positions of authority. They sacrificed that to try to get some kind of different thing in a spiritual landscape. And Jude in verse 6 brings out this crazy thing about angels that left their positions. They abandoned their proper dwelling, and they decided, God then decided to keep them in darkness. And we will take a look, probably in another future episode, even another future series, a little bit more about what this means. And then verse 7. Verse 7 for some of my what I call my liberal pastor friends. They have this idea that we shouldn't ever be held responsible for our actions. And here's this thing in verse 7 that shows up. Verse 7 says, "In a similar way, Sodom and Gomorrah and the surrounding towns gave themselves up to sexual immorality and perversion, and they serve as an example as those who suffer the punishment of eternal fire." Now, let's just deal with this for just a moment, and here it is in a nutshell. In Genesis 18, verse 1, it says that the Lord appeared to Abraham near the great trees of Mamre, while he was sitting near the entrance to his tent in the heat of the day. Abraham looked up, saw 3 men standing nearby, and when he saw them, he hurried from the entrance of his tent to meet them and bowed to the ground. And he starts talking to them, and don't pass your feet. So let's bring some water. Let us wash your feet. Get some rest. And basically, this whole thing starts off with a promise that Abram's going to have a child by the next year. But then these men get up to leave in verse 16, and they look towards Sodom, and Abraham was walking along with them. And it says here in verse 17, kind of something really interesting. So the Lord said, "Shall I hide from Abraham what I am about to do? He's going to be a great and powerful nation. All the nations of the earth will be blessed for him. I've chosen him." And so God, what he does is that he shares with Abraham, I'm getting ready to go out and destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. And at that point in time, Abraham starts negotiating with God, trying to get down, well, how many people would you spare these 2 towns for? The reality of it is that at that point in time, the Lord left, and then the 2 men that were left, the 2 angels, 2 angels in Genesis chapter 19, they go down to Sodom, and they go down to Lot's house, and Lot brings them inside. Now, we have a tendency to say that, well, this whole thing is about homosexuality, and I'm gonna really maybe blow some of your guys' minds. I don't know that it is. I'm going to say that if Abraham could recognize that these 2 guys were angels, that maybe the people in town recognize that these were 2 angels as well. And somehow that they wanted to have sex with these 2 angels. At minimum, it kind of sounds a little bit like homosexuality. But these 2 guys, they're having this conversation with the town. He strikes everybody blind. Lot offers them his 2 daughters. And they don't want to have anything to do with it. To me, this is a supernatural thing more than it's a homosexuality thing, but that's a whole nother discussion for a whole nother episode. But let's take a look here at what happens here. Sodom and Gomorrah after that were destroyed. The 2 guys get Lot and his family out of there, and Lot's wife, she turns back. They were told not to look back, and she turns back, and she's turned into a pillar of salt. But let's get back down to the whole essence of what was going on at Sodom and Gomorrah. Sodom and Gomorrah is talked about several times throughout the Old Testament. So here's the verse that I want to talk just real briefly about Sodom and Gomorrah, because sometimes we misunderstand what this whole thing was really about. In the book of Ezekiel, chapter 16, verse 49, it says, "Now this was the sin of your sister Sodom. She and her daughters were arrogant, overfed, and unconcerned. They did not help the poor and needy." Interesting thing, there's a little tradition that's talked about about Sodom and Gomorrah, and that is that when a stranger would come to their town, they would say, "Oh my goodness, we are so glad to have you here," and they would give them all of these great gifts, and they would give them all these rich, expensive things. And when the person would go in to eat somewhere or ask somebody for a place to stay, said, "Oh my goodness, how in the world?" do you need our measly support? I mean, you are very, very rich. You can certainly take care of yourself." And that person would go around trying to look for a place to stay or even a place to eat. And they said, "Oh my goodness, you have so much money. It should be real easy for you to find a place to eat." And they would just say, "Well, we just can't take care of you." And then what would happen is that there's several occasions where it was talked about in some older traditions where when that person was, they were loaded up with all this stuff, and then they would die of hunger in the streets, the people would go back out and get their stuff and wait for the next person to come along. That's the idea that happens behind Sodom and Gomorrah, and sometimes we miss those kind of things in taking a look at Jude. But still, Jude throws out this crazy thing about the idea that Sodom and Gomorrah and the surrounding towns, they gave themselves up to sexual immorality, which is true. And this is the perversion. I think the perversion is not the perversion of sexual perversion, but actually the perversion of hospitality and the perversion of grace. Let's get back to this whole idea of worldviews. The idea here in the worldview that Jude talks about is that these three things in what I call our modern Christianity, these three things are no longer believed. They're no longer taught. They're hardly even discussed. The Exodus has been, oh, well, they crossed the Reed Sea, or they did this and they did that, and just something, just hang on for a second. Here's a really good book. It's called the Exodus Case by Leonard Moeller. Talks about and really lays out a really good case from Egypt all the way through the crossing of the Red Sea. Find out on the internet. When we take a look at about the angels, we have a tendency to just say, "Oh, well, we don't have to know anything about angels because somehow that's really weird, or just wrong." We have all these different ideas, and the reality of it is we're losing our spiritual landscape and our biblical worldview. And then when it comes down to Sodom and Gomorrah, we live in a very sexually charged world. You can't flip the TV stations. You can't flip open a magazine where it's just not being thrown in our face all the time. But we really are losing the idea of purity, and we're really losing the idea of this is how God made us. And this whole worldview comes back down to creation. And here's why I say that. If evolution wants to throw the idea out that we have all somehow come from monkeys, why are we surprised when we behave like animals to one another? So I want to leave you with this thought and think about creation and evolution and just how do we interact with each other really works. Charles Darwin wrote a book called The Origin of Species, but what we don't ever pay attention to is the idea of what the subtitle of the book is. The subtitle is The Origin of Species, is the title, by means of natural selection, or the preservation of favored races in the struggle of life. If you really want to take on Darwinism and you really want to take on evolutionism and hold on to that as a worldview, then you also have to understand then that there is a racially charged component about that. And racism is not based in creation, because if creation is true, then we're all of really one race. If you want to hold on to evolutionism by the definition of what Charles Darwin throws out in The Origin of Species and the title of his book, is racially based. So just think about some of those things as we kind of start going through, oh, is it possible? Have I ever been deceived? And exactly what is truth and what is a lie? And is the supernatural possible? And how do we address all of these crazy and important ideas when we come down to a biblical worldview? We'll see you next time.